In 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, all Highland regiments wore the Highland dress. It had been established as early as 1746, when the Dress Act was passed, that Highland regiments had the honour of going into battle wearing the traditional kilt and the rest of the Highland dress. Meanwhile, the rest of the civilian population were prohibited for a time from wearing the Highland dress because it had become associated with Jacobitism, but that is another story. Anyway, in 1914, all of the Highland regiments, with only a few exceptions, such as for officers, were wearing Highland dress, which primarily consisted of the kilt. This video is going to be about the problems which Highlanders had in the First World War in the trenches with their traditional Highland dress, and how they overcame these problems with several different modifications and uniform changes. So in 1914, most Highland soldiers would have been wearing a Glengarry cap, which is this very distinctive piece of headgear here, which had their regimental badge on, red turrey, dark blue for the black watch, and all of them had these two tails here, I suppose just decorative. And of course, it isn't much more than decorative. It's not going to protect you from pieces of flying shrapnel from exploding shells, certainly not going to protect you from a bullet. Really, it's not going to protect you from anything at all, so not very practical when artillery is wreaking havoc and there's very accurate rifle fire. This as well is a magnet for enemy snipers. This shiny badge in the sun would pretty much be a death sentence, so soldiers quite quickly learned in the trenches to take off their regimental cap badges. All British regiments at this time were wearing some sort of cloth cap, which provided no protection from shrapnel, so that is a major problem. The way the Highlanders overcame the problems with the Glengarry cap were actually very similar to the rest of the regiments, the English regiments and the Commonwealth regiments in the British Army, which was that they swapped their cloth caps around 1916 for tin hats, as they were known as, or shrapnel helmets, technically the Brodie helmet. And these were obviously much more suitable for protecting the user against shrapnel. It wouldn't protect whoever was wearing it from bullets, direct enemy rifle fire. Before the tin hat was adopted, the Glengarry had actually been replaced in most Highland regiments by 1915 by a slightly more practical, possibly a bit warmer as well, tam-o-shanter, or tam, or tammy, lots of different nicknames. And these were typically khaki and continued sometimes to display the regimental cap badge, although, as I said earlier, these were quite often taken off by wily soldiers who didn't want to get their heads shot off by enemy snipers. Now, moving on specifically to the kilt, which is of course unique to the Highland regiments. So, of course, it was an honour for a Scottish soldier to go into battle wearing his ancestral Highland dress, but in the trenches they quickly proved to be quite unpopular for a number of reasons. Well, firstly, they were just a pain to keep clean and dry in the muddy environment of the trenches, so soldiers wore kilt aprons. This wasn't actually something invented during the First World War. It had actually been adopted in the previous Boer War, sort of around 1900, to keep the kilt clean and dry, protect it from thorns and barbed wire and that sort of thing, stop it from being torn and messed up. So they covered the front of the kilt. Eventually, as the war progressed, kilt aprons were adopted, which also covered the back of the kilt. The back of the kilt, by the way, is called the pleats. So that was one modification which the Highlanders made to their traditional uniforms to protect them and adapt them for trench warfare. But the kilt has many more problems than just being a pain to keep clean and dry. For example, one of the most pressing problems is the fact that your knees and a bit of your leg are exposed to things like barbed wire, mustard gas later in the war, which burns the skin, and another thing is simply the cold. It could get very cold. Of course, you can't do much exercise standing in a small foxhole or a trench like this. You're kind of set in your position. So the Highlanders were probably particularly prone to hypothermia, even though they were used to a cold Scottish climate, a cold, wet Scottish climate. Standing in the trenches in their kilts must have been quite a miserable experience in the winter. So a modification which the Highlanders made to protect their legs and keep them more warm and dry was simply wrapping bits of cloth around their legs. And in some instances, relatively few actually, the Highlanders adopted normal trousers or tartan trews. Another thing are these brightly coloured black and red for the Black Watch kilt hose or kilt hose tops. These were a huge pain to keep clean. Very bright, it's not very camouflage, so they switched to darker kilt socks, such as grey or khaki. To actually keep the kilt hose dry and clean, the Highlanders wore gaiters in 1914, which were what they'd been wearing for a long time, including during the Boer Wars. These were white or khaki. But then around 1915, they switched to puttees. For the Highland regiments, these were sometimes short puttees like this, or long puttees. In this case, these are actually long puttees, which I've just made shorter by winding them around more times in a small area. So that is the uniform of a Scottish Highlander during the First World War. How it was like to begin with in 1914, and how over the years of the war it changed to become more suitable for modern warfare in the trenches of the Western Front.